and it focused on ColdFusion 7. And, Chris Ng actually gave a talk last year on kind of the application and code side of that, but it kind of reached my interest and got me kind of motivated to work on a talk for it. And people in the ColdFusion community are really developer focused, and they didn't really want a security guy like me who just really wanted to know how to fuck it up. They didn't really want to give me a lot of information on it, so I kind of had to go through and figure that stuff out. So ColdFusion, there are basically two things. You have the Adobe product, which is called ColdFusion. ColdFusion markup, is that working? Is mic still on? Okay. And there's ColdFusion markup language, which is basically the language, so the ASP, the HTML, the JavaScript piece of that, whatever. There's the language of ColdFusion, and then there's Adobe's product. There's also other open source products, Raylo, Mira, CMS, and some other things that are actually will run ColdFusion markup language, but aren't Adobe ColdFusion. So we're primarily just going to talk about Adobe's ColdFusion. So according to Adobe, 12,000 companies use it, applications, 11,000 downloads, a bunch of user groups. So according to Adobe, it's pretty largely used, I would think. Lots of people use it, so Boeing, lots of education, NASA, Gov, probably everyone, you probably can't read it, but there's lots of pretty big names on the list there. If you're into like Pac-10 and big schools, all these schools are actually ColdFusion shops. So it's got some presence. According to Mira, CMS, those guys use it as well. There's some overlap, so I don't know if they're just picking .index.cfm or what. But. So according to Google, there was 750 million sites running it. That seem like a lot? It's a few, okay. And so if you want to find sites running it, there's lots of Google dorks for that, and that's an example of some. And some of those will give you things like index of component utils is definitely Adobe ColdFusion. So you can do searches for that. That came up with about 4,600 results, most of those. Usually you can sometimes find misconfigured servers when you're using these Google dorks. And so this is an example of directory listings enabled, but it's also a ColdFusion system. You've got sites like .cfm, which has a list. Kind of not really updated, but a lot of the ColdFusion 7 ones are still ColdFusion 7, so if you're actually wanting to go test code or look around at things and see who's actually running some of this stuff, the site's mostly accurate, and then has an export to CSV if you want to go that route. People will sometimes bookmark useful things, so like Delicious had a couple people who had bookmarked their admin interfaces out on the net, so you can go there and look at stuff. So this is kind of what it looks like. ColdFusion 5. Haven't seen one of these on the internet in quite a while. 6 I've seen. 7 I've seen quite a bit. So if you notice up to 7, there was only password authentication, so no username. Starting with ColdFusion 8, you actually had the option for having a username. There's 9. So 9 is what most people you'll find running. Well, that's what Adobe tells you to be running, and then they just released last month 10 beta. So the public beta is out for that if you want to mess with it. So going after it and finding stuff, I wrote similar to last year. I did an Oracle talk on attacking Oracle on the web. I basically wrote a little scanner that would look for common vulnerable ColdFusion URLs. So I'll be releasing this after the talk. Basically just scans for current stuff and then as far back as like ColdFusion MX6 for vulnerable stuff. So if you come across one, you could run that and see if you've got any, useful URLs out. And this can help you find entry points and then vulnerable things. That's just another page of it. According to CV details, there was a whopping 43 vulnerabilities in all time for ColdFusion. Is that a lot, or is that not many? What do you guys think? No, I don't think it's that many, actually. And if you look at it, the majority of those are actually cross-site scripting bugs. So depending on where you live in the world, that may or may not be useful to you. But that's not that many code exec. I think it says 2 for code execution. I think I'm going to show that you can actually use a bunch of little things to equal code execution in ColdFusion. That's the idea of the talk. So Common vulns that you'll run into. Information disclosure is really, really prevalent. Cross-site scripting, SQL injection is common, and admin interfaces are exposed. And I'll have a whole section on that later. So information disclosure, ColdFusion comes in Enterprise and Standard. Enterprise allows you to also run JSP in conjunction with ColdFusion, where Standard will only run ColdFusion and HTML. If you want to find the two, it's pretty simple. You basically look for a non-existent JSP page. If you get a 404, it's Enterprise because it handles JSP. You won't just say, hey, that's not there. Where if it's Standard, you'll get a license exception or a 500 error. Useful, so it helps me fingerprint which is which becomes useful later on down the road. Very common to see debugging enabled. And when debugging is enabled, you'll actually get full path disclosure. Useful for anybody that does web apps or does anything. Is that useful? Yeah. Helps a lot to know, one, is it Windows or Linux? And then two, what's the full path? So if you've got file uploads or you've got directory traversals, you kind of need that piece of information to get useful things. So that's one for Windows. Here's one for Linux. So I probably wouldn't have guessed that if I was looking at that app. I very rarely see things in /export/home. So that's kind of an example of, hey, I wouldn't have guessed that, so it was really handy that that was available to me with a single tick mark. Another example of a Windows one. So this one was kind of in its normal place, C, inetpub, www-root, where the first one was not, or maybe it was not. So that was the D. A lot of times you can also get, you can actually get the database query to come out if debugging is enabled. So in this case, I put a tick in for ID equals 1 tick, and then it actually showed me where the variable was blowing up. Useful? Yeah? Okay. Also, down in the kind of underneath the red box shows, it's commented out, but the data source, so it actually showed me the database name. You usually get the JDBC error, so you know if it's MS SQL, Access, Oracle, or whatever. And it also had a full path disclosure on that too. And then just another example of this one. This one was actually doing some CF param, so you can actually write secure code with this, but again, just showing where the database, it showed basically the full database query and how it was being constructed. So if you're going to go after SQL injection, there's some other things you can, basically it has the full database query there for you to look at. So lots and lots of information disclosure. So cross-site scripting, who there likes cross-site scripting, thinks it's neat? I don't. I'm a network guy, brought up network guy primarily. So I don't get as excited about cross-site scripting as some people do, but it can be pretty cool for ColdFusion. Chris Ng actually last year talked a lot about script protect. It's basically a blacklisting approach. There's the blacklist. So any of you guys that raised your hand see some problems with the blacklist for that? Can you bypass that? Yeah, a couple yes. So the answer is yes. If you go read Chris's white paper, he goes into really good detail on how to bypass it. So old ColdFusion, you can just throw scripts in. Newer ones, you can do things like body unload and some other things. Again, Chris's paper goes into really good detail of why script protect is not so good and ways to get around it. We'll talk more about that later. SQL injection. Almost every time I see equals some number in ColdFusion, it's vulnerable to SQL injection. Will can attest to that in the back, yeah? So if you're ever doing a ColdFusion app and you see equals some number, there's a good chance that query is vulnerable. And so a recent pen test, this is some of the code that was actually returned back to me in an error page. And then, so doing that code came from that query, and I basically just did your add version, and then we had error-based injection in that. So useful. I got the SQL query back in the error page, and then we were able to look and say, hey, well, they're not doing any kind of sanitization on that, and then able to exploit that with, that's an example of error, and it also did union-based injection. So lots and lots of, in my experience, SQL injection for ColdFusion apps. So we got an Insta-Shell section. So basically, even though CVE details said there was basically 2 remote exploits, I've got at least 3 that I know of, and that's these 3. You have the Blaze DS AMF External XML Entity Injection Bug. ColdFusion 8.01 had an FCK editor. They enabled the connector and also had a vulnerable version of FCK Editor. And then has everyone heard of like the locale path traversal that came out about 2 years ago? That was actually a pretty big bug. That started out as like an information disclosure bug, and then a bunch of the guys complained. The guy from GNU Citizen was like, hey, no, that's actually code execution, and went into this whole big long thing of turning path traversal into code execution, which you don't always get to do. Right. Right. The big point that they made for that was that Adobe and I guess CVSS had rated it as like a 5 or something, and in reality it should have been a 10. So you probably can't read that, but this is kind of an example of when you go click on a patch, you have this giant list of instructions. So it's like download the zip file, go to the admin page, take a backup of your stuff, unzip the thing, overwrite this file, and I'll go here and do this. Well, if you've got this, you need to do that. So I'm not a ColdFusion admin, but I could probably make a mistake in that long process of things for patching. The admin interface doesn't actually alert you that a patch is available. You kind of got to look at Adobe and follow the mailing list and do some other things. So now, with most CMSs and other things, we're kind of getting used to the application telling me that I have a patch to apply, right? Yeah. That's kind of the norm these days, where ColdFusion does not. So when you start doing this and you start seeing vulnerable things and you start to wonder why I start seeing vulnerable instances of ColdFusion, to me this is one of the reasons that I would think this would happen. Is very manual process. And same thing for upgrading. When you talk about upgrading from 7 to 8, 8 to 9, most of those settings don't carry over. So if you've done lockdowns and other things, you actually have to go through and redo that again. So, pro tip. For all the Insta-Shell stuff, it's kind of version dependent. Not my module, but inside of Metasploit is a ColdFusion version module, which if the admin interface is up, which is the ones I showed you on the hit list, it can actually query that, find out if it's 6, 7, 8, 9, and then return that back to you. You can also just check a WSDL file that exists in it. I know for sure on 7 through 9. I haven't had that chance to check on 6. But at that URL, so you've got site, CFID, admin API, base CFC WSDL, will actually tell you the exact ColdFusion version you're running, which is useful. I'll make all these slides available later for you guys. But so that's handy because it tells you basically major version and then some of the minor versions. If not all the patches actually increase the minor version, but some do. So that's 2 examples of seeing that, hey, that one was running 9 in this version and 8 in this version, which can help you identify if some patches are applied or not. Useful? Cool. Yeah. So the XML Entity Injection, there's the link to the advisory. Basically, it gives you arbitrary file read on vulnerable hosts. There's a Metasploit module for that. That's the versions that it's vulnerable in. So 9, 8, 8.0, and 7.02. So it kind of looks like that. You can basically do an entity injection at the top. So that just tells me that I want to see the contents of C ColdFusion 8 lib password.properties. And then in the XML response that comes back will actually be the file if it exists. So pretty useful, yeah? Cool. Also, we'll do directory listings. So if you need to actually kind of navigate around and you didn't have information like path disclosure, you can kind of just say, okay, oh, well, I can see what's in C. I can see what's in C download. So this is one of my more favorite ones because they actually had ColdFusion patches as a folder, but they hadn't actually applied any of the patches for this bug. And they had Tripwire too, which I thought was humorous, but none of that worked. All right, that joke died. FCK Editor. Anybody see when this bug came out? Yeah, Dan. Yeah.
I'm not sure how you print that past the arbitrary file
So at the top, instead of asking for a file, I just asked for C downloads, and then it returned the contents of like a directory listing for C downloads. Yeah. The paper goes into pretty good detail of why it's doing that. It's like a 10-page white paper from the security assessment guys on why it's doing that and exactly why that works. Yeah. I could try to explain it, but the white paper does way better than I'll mumble through it. So basically for FCK Editor, ColdFusion 8.0.1 shipped with the file upload connector enabled, which means you could upload ColdFusion files to this thing. In conjunction with that was that FCK Editor input sanitization issue. So in addition to ColdFusion shipping it with the upload enabled, there was also a MIME type issue with that, so you could upload things that were not ColdFusion shells. So those two bugs work together. So the Metasploit module actually uploads a JSP page and executes that, and then you get a ColdFusion command shell, or a Windows command shell back. That's kind of what that's showing there. So that would only work on an enterprise version. You could pretty easily write your own ColdFusion in the event that you had one that was standard. You could just write ColdFusion that would upload and do the same thing, but you get the idea. Really, the two things went together for kind of the magic secret sauce of exploiting that bug. It affected FCK Editor prior to 2.6.4.1. You can always check the version by checking that URL, and it comes back with the ColdFusion version the FCK Editor version that's running. So useful. All right, so if I'm looking for that bug, I figured out that it's 8. I've got my path. Now I want to see if if this is enabled. If it's 2.7 or 3 something, then I know that I probably don't even need to bother with at least the MIME type issue. I still want to check the connector to see if the connector is enabled and I can upload things. But it helps you just kind of figure out, because FCK Editor's had actually quite a lot of bugs in it over the years. So if you got a really old version, you may want to look into that as well. So the locale path traversal, this is the big one that came out 2 years ago now. New Citizen blog has a full walkthrough of it. If you don't want to read it, essentially you don't need the password for this. You can actually pass the hash to the admin interface. Right? So if you're able to get password.properties holds the SHA-1 hash of the passwords, if you're able to get a hold of that through one way or the other, you can bypass the need for cracking that hash and just pass it. Useful? Yeah, I mean, there's not too many sites that once I have a hash of a password, I can just use that to log in with. Both Metasploit and Canvas have modules to, if things are like basically in default places, you can use those to get access. Here's the vulnerable versions. So 6, 7, 8. So Immunity reported that 9 was vulnerable. I think old versions of 9 that people downloaded were vulnerable, but then once this bug came out, the one that you can download off the Adobe site now is patched. So maybe old versions of 9. I hadn't gotten around to checking. So 7, if you see ColdFusion 7, it's always vulnerable to this bug. There's no patch for it. Same thing for 6. 6 is always vulnerable. They didn't release a patch. So if you come across ColdFusion 7, good to go. 8 was vulnerable as well, but they did release a patch for that. So if you find this in 8, people just haven't applied the patch. It's much more common that people have applied this patch. This is one of the ones in ColdFusion land that got a lot of attention. A lot of people went through and patched this, but obviously you can still find these out on the web. So the problem with that exploit is I need to know full path. So if things are hanging out in C ColdFusion, pretty easy. But we saw before, like export home. Would anyone even know to look for that in export home? Not me. So you can kind of queue the disclosure vulns, quite a bit of those. If it's misconfigured one way or the other, and they have directory listings that can help you identify where ColdFusion lives on the box. And then there's also ways to have misconfigured component utils access. So if someone has kind of jacked up directory permissions and allows access to these, you can actually view via CFC Explorer library. So CFCs are basically ColdFusion libraries, and via CFC Explorer you can look at these libraries and see which functions each library contains, but it also gives you the full path to where that file lives. So you basically got 3 ways to help determine where things are living in ColdFusion. Useful? Right? So other things you can do where you got to work for it is brute forcing RDS access if it's enabled, and then brute forcing admin pages. Some of the extra goodies you get with ColdFusion: no account lockouts. Depending on the version, no username required. So 7 and below didn't. In RDS, you can still, even with ColdFusion 9, configure RDS access with no username, just password off. No password complexity requirements, and no real logging inside of ColdFusion. The web server is obviously going to log every get or post you do, but there's no logging inside of ColdFusion that says you had 6 million failed attempts when you log in. It just keeps going. So useful for me if I'm trying to get into that. We'll talk about the salting stuff. So anybody seen RDS or used it or know what it is? One? Okay, so it's the remote development service. So way back when Lares had ColdFusion and before Adobe bought it, they basically had, to oversimplify, it's FTP over HTTP, and allows you basically file system access, so you can upload ColdFusion code. ColdFusion Builder is what Adobe wants you to use now, which is basically like a full IDE, like Eclipse. Anybody use Eclipse for development? ColdFusion Builder is basically Adobe's Eclipse product, which has support for RDS. Eclipse has a ColdFusion plugin. ColdFusion Builder allows you to do all that. I'll let you read. Basically, it looks like you're working with files on your own computer. So it kind of looks like that. On the left, you can do file system access, so you can upload, download files, do whatever you want. On the right shows you can also do a data view, so you can actually interact with databases on the box as well if they're present. So pretty powerful if you can guess that password, right? Yes, no? Yeah, I think so. So I wrote a module. It's actually pretty simple. It just does a post request to a URL to see if it's enabled. If things are enabled, you'll get a 200 back along with the ColdFusion server version and also a client version, which is RDS stuff, but useful. So if RDS is enabled, you get the exact version of ColdFusion that's running, and you're also told that now you can start authenticating to that. Handy, right? So if I'm looking at a whole bunch of hosts, I can actually run through and check that stuff. And the scanner module does that for you. It actually will do the post request and let you know if it's there or not. Assuming that it's enabled. Oh. No account lockout at all. And it's password off. I think 9 allows you to set a username, but it's not by default. So, and it can be A. It can really just be anything. It's pretty bad. So I think after 7, it's not enabled by default, but it's really just a tick box as you're doing the installer where you want it enabled or not. So all the lockdown guidance will tell you to disable that on production servers, but clearly people are going to use this anyway, or firewall rules would be mismanaged, or for whatever reason. CFID main IDE CFM actually doesn't exist. It's not a real file. ColdFusion actually hooks that request when it sees it and does some internal things to handle the RDS stuff. So that file really isn't even present in the folder structure. It sees that request and then handles it and does some things. I don't know why you would deploy that, but people do. So admin interfaces. So prior to ColdFusion 8 was password only off. ColdFusion 8 introduced the option to have usernames, but it's pretty easy to tell if admin's there or you have other usernames. So if they haven't added usernames, it will pre-populate admin for you and gray it out so you can't change it, which makes it pretty easy to know if it's admin or not. And then if they've enabled extra usernames, it will be blank. You can't change admin, so admin's still a valid username. But you at least know when you see one that looks like that they have more than admin on the system. Handy. I don't know. That's, Ben, you think that's handy? It's handy. So like I mentioned a couple slides back, the administrator index page salts the password. I don't know if you guys can read that. Basically, every 60 seconds, it gives you a new salt value. And then when you do the post, it does an HMAC SHA-1 of the salt value and then of your SHA-1 password. So if you're curious why the pass the hash works, this is basically why the pass the hash works, is you just substitute that piece in. Right? One grabs the salt. I think Burp can handle that situation. You could certainly script something to where every 60 seconds I grab the new salt and I add that and continue on, but actually you don't have to. All these other pages don't actually don't have the salt. So if you want to start brute forcing other pages like component utils login, component utils wizard, there's a multitude of other pages that give you the option to enter your RDS password or your admin password that don't salt. Useful. And so when you can tell when you get the password right, it doesn't log you in. Yeah, Dan. They are different. They should be different. They are two different things. Correct. Correct. So if RDS is enabled, you could potentially guess the RDS password or the admin password. Yeah, so you can't go back and log into the admin interface with the RDS password. But say you were to guess the RDS password, you could use the RDS client to now get file system access and write your ColdFusion shell or pull down files, do whatever you needed to do. Right? So at that point you could write data to the host, where the admin password obviously gives you access to the admin interface. And I think as I go, you'll see that those two pieces of access actually kind of meet in the middle. You basically can get file system access via either method, which can very quickly turn into remote code execution. So the top one shows basically a guess with the wrong passwords. The bottom one shows that when you guess the right password, it sets a cookie. So pretty easy to tell as you're brute forcing when you get a cookie that actually has some values, you got a right answer somewhere along the way. Just super easy to do in Burp, right? Yeah, so that kind of shows in this case. So password is my admin password. Password 1 was my RDS password. And so the module says, oh, hey, both of those passwords. Yeah, you guess, basically you guess both of those. Again, I wrote a Metasploit module a long time ago to do it, but you can do it in Burp because it's basically just a post request. Good? Handy? Okay. So if you guys caught any of my other talks, passwords suck, so you can usually guess something. So attacking other stuff. Anybody heard of the Solar search service? Basically, the Solar indexes data on your ColdFusion thing. So if this was initially deployed where it was exposed without authentication, you could get to this thing. You could run search strings. If you had sensitive data indexed in your ColdFusion pages, you could potentially have something useful there. Lots of clicking on config and info would give you like where the paths and everything else were. So that would help you if those things were exposed. Not really that sexy. If you want to interact with the ColdFusion libraries, it's pretty simple. You can call, so foo.cfc is our library. You can basically say the method is my method, and then you can pass it arguments, and that invokes the various methods that you have. So that's kind of an example of doing one. You've got administrator CFC. That's the library. The method is getSalt. In this case, getSalt doesn't actually take any arguments, and then it would return a value. So you've got remote is an option. Public and private, I think, are the other two. So if a method is exposed to being remote, you can invoke it via a web browser and get a response back. So in this case, getSalt is remote because it needs that value to do the admin page, where a lot of the other ones will be public or private, and that depends on where in the ColdFusion code that you write that you can call those. I haven't found anything sexy in the default stuff, but people are encouraged to make their own libraries, so you may be able to find, you know, custom libraries that are remotely invocable that may be exploitable from the web app side of the house. All right, so if you're actually doing a web app test on a ColdFusion box, you definitely want to start to see, can I start browsing to these? Can I start invoking various methods and getting things back? Yeah.
Easy way or the way you got to enumerate the methods? Maybe they get indexed?
They do get indexed. There's a, let's find the slide. So this CFC Explorer, if you know the name of it, this is actually for showing the documentation for those. So a lot of times if you mess this up, like you're trying to mess with it, it will just show you, oh, well, hey, dummy, here it is. You can just look at it. If directory listings are enabled, you can usually just browse to it, and it will just start showing you all this stuff. And certainly, if you have a password, you can authenticate to the component utils environment and then look at all of them. There's a giant list of them. So there's a few ways to take a look at those. So misconfigured, or if I have a password, or sometimes, depending on permissions, they'll just show them to you. Cooking. Any questions so far? Got it all? Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Like, you mean like I knew it was administrator, CFC, but I wanted to start enumerating methods inside of that? Yeah. I think so. I don't know. I'd have to check again. Yeah, I think he's right. I think that if you guessed the right method, I think it would say something to the effect of, you didn't pass me my argument, and so you would know. I think a lot of times when I've messed with it, it will actually just give you back to that component utils page, the CFC Explorer page, and be like, oh, well, you jacked that request up. Here's the lib documentation so you can see what you need to be doing correctly. I think that's a checkbox somewhere in the admin interface of like whether to display that information to you or not, or to silently error out. Sorry, that's not a better answer to your question, but yeah. Yeah. You can. I think. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one either. I would think so. In the advisory for that, and a lot of those security guys, ColdFusion security guys said that you definitely could index things that you don't want indexed, and therefore, if you had access to this query string, could do that. Sorry, I'm just trying to see it. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to look into that a little bit. I don't think I've seen this on a pen test. It's probably because I'm focusing on looking for the admin interface to do some of this other stuff, and hadn't noticed it. But yeah, that's a good idea, actually. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So cookies. Cookies are awesome. Normally, that's what you show with your cross-site scripting pop-up. I know the guys that like cross-site scripting are like, you suck. But so a good question is, would anybody not be comfortable giving me their session cookie right now, and I waited a week to try to do something with it? Would anybody not feel comfortable doing that? Like 3 people? So maybe to go about it a different way, most of us assume that cookies have a limited lifespan or session variables that are only useful for that session. So if I were to get your cookie and I allowed you to log out, close your browser, reboot your computer, reboot the server, would any of you still be okay doing that? No fun. All right. I'll be honest, I would normally let you do that. I would not, if a web app was functioning the way it should, if I were to log the application, it should be okay to. Would the web app guys agree with that? With the caveat that if the application is behaving like it should? Okay, because it should invalidate the session, tear it down, it should not be used, no one should be able to put it anywhere else and use it anything else. So in general, I think the cookies that ColdFusion uses do that with the exception of the CFadmin and component utils cookies. So the CFadmin cookie actually base64 decodes to username, SHA-1 hash, and CFadmin. So is that bad? Does anybody see a problem with that? What did I need to log into the admin interface with? The admin SHA-1 hash. So that doesn't change. There's no entropy. There's no randomization. There's no anything for that. Do cookies get stored anywhere along the way in anybody's environments? Okay. Also, admin interface doesn't require SSL by default. You can enable it, but it doesn't require it. Neither does RDS. I don't know. Is that bad, or kind of bad, or that's kind of in the what the fuck land for me. Like that's pretty bad. So to recap, I got the CFadmin cookie. We agree there's no randomness at all in the cookie, right? No randomness. So SSL is enabled on the admin interface by default. The cookie base64 decodes to the SHA-1 hash of the user. 10 minutes, all right. So we don't actually, and then we've shown with the locale traversal and some other things, we don't actually need to crack that password anymore. I can just pass it, log into the admin interface. If I needed to change it, I could, but you could just pass it all day long. So I think we all agree that's bad. So the component utils cookie actually base64 decodes to the actual password of the account. Super bad, really bad, like I could get at the oh my god, what the fuck barbecue bad, like I don't know who was thinking or not thinking that day. That's pretty hardcore, I think. So, I don't know, bad. Everybody agree bad? Yeah. That's a good question. I don't think so. I'd have to do some checking, but I don't think so. I think that's another one that you can configure that's not on by default, but can. One of the guys I'll mention at the end of the presentation has a whole bunch of how to securely deploy ColdFusion, and I'm pretty sure like SSL only or HTTP only and secure flags enabling all that stuff is there, just not by default. Yeah, I was pretty much floored when I found that. I was just like, no fucking way that they're doing that. But they were. I tested it on a couple versions. It's doing it. Just, wow. So I was like, but that can't happen in the real world. Well, it does. So I did some Googling, found a CFadmin cookie. It had some info in it. So this was from March 2009. Got the cookie value. So this is ColdFusion 7, so it's actually SHA-1 hash, and CFadmin. So it didn't have the, well, that makes sense, right? Because ColdFusion 7 didn't have usernames. So in 2012 and 2009, the passwords were the same. So, and then actually they had set this in 2007. You can see on the bottom little box there that 2007 is when they actually set that cookie, that password. So for 5 years, they've had the admin password to their box out on the internet. Not good. All right, so post-exploitation. So by default, ColdFusion runs a system on Windows, which is awesome. Can configure it to run as an account, but not many people do that. It runs as nobody on any kind of Solaris, Linux, Unix environments. So obviously from like your Metasploit Git shell kind of land, you want ColdFusion on Windows. It's also awesome when people, true story, did a pen test. It was an ASP app that had file upload. Tried and tried. We're trying to put ASP shells up. It was running as network service. Wasn't getting anywhere. Was able to do some directory listings and see they had a ColdFusion path uploaded ColdFusion shell, got a system shell back out. So when you map bindings for various languages, you can use that. That's got some awesome stuff for it too. So scheduling tasks. So once you have access to the admin interface, you need a way to get code on the box. You can use the schedule task functionality to do that. So basically, you give it a one-time task. So I want to do it that day at 11:05. I give it the URL for the bat file, the ColdFusion shell, the executable I want to download, and then I say save output file to somewhere on the file system that I want to download that to. Handy? Yeah, I thought that was awesome. So basically, you say, submit. It runs the one-time task, or it waits for however many minutes you gave it ahead and executes that task and should download that file to somewhere on the web root. So if you've downloaded your ColdFusion shell or JSP shell, you're done. But if you wanted to actually run a bat file or executable that you put on the box, you want to make a system probe that we want to fail, and the fail action is going to be to run our code. So that functionality is built in. I can do a system probe. So I want to do, my probe name is execute interpreter. I want to pick a URL. It doesn't matter what. If the response received back doesn't contain blah, I want you to execute the program that I previously downloaded. That's pretty handy. And then, so you can have that execute every 30 minutes or whatever. I think 30 minutes is the minimum for a system probe, but that little green button right here just tells it to go ahead and run that right now. So you can actually, once you set that, push the green button, it will execute that thing immediately, and you'll get your shell back out. So that's one method. Also, once you have access to the admin interface, you can get access to the stored database credentials. So Hernan Ochoa had a blog post on this in 2008, still works today. Basically go to the data source selection component. Click on that. So this one has at the bottom here that's highlighted as test, and that's a Microsoft SQL server. Inside a test, you can view source on that, and there'll be an encoded password hash for that. Using his tool, you can decrypt that and get the clear text password back out of that. So you can use you've got the IP of the database, the username, and the password, and now you can use whatever you want to do database connections, right? So if that's SA and a password, now we can actually go, if we were nobody on Linux land, we can use those database creds to actually probably become somebody on another host. So now we can start using that access to move laterally in the network. If you have file system access, so say you just had RDS access and I could just pull and download and upload download files, the same values live in those NeoQuery and NeoDataSource XML files. You could just pull those down. Each individual database entry is in those files, and you could do the same thing with those. ColdFusion shells. So anybody written a ColdFusion shell or interacted with that? It has awesome tags like CF execute, which does what you think it does, which is just executes whatever you pass to that. CF registry for interacting with like Windows registry, CF file for file I/O operations, and CF HTTP to do HTTP operations. It's actually a big list, but that's more of the fun ones. So probably the simplest CFM shell that you'll see out on the web is CF execute, passes the executable or the command you want to run along with any arguments, and then just executes that. A lot of the common guidance will tell you to disable CF execute, which makes sense. There's really no reason to be doing that. ColdFusion is also Java-based, so anything you could write in Java, so Java runtime exec command also works. So if they've disabled any of these dangerous CF tags, if you can write Java, it will also run. So in this case, we've got get properties, get environment, gives you something like that. So that means it'd be pretty trivial to make it say, do the same thing as run command, and here's the arguments I want to pass to that. So very rarely see CF execute disabled. So remember, standard versus enterprise. Enterprise will run JSP, so you could upload common JSP shells as well, and those will work. And then ColdFusion 9 and above introduced CF script, which is JavaScript for ColdFusion. So again, you can do things like show me runtime free memory, runtime physical memory, runtimes anything. So a lot of the things you can do with Java, you can do with CF script and do similar stuff. Useful? Cool. So stuff to read. So Pete Freitag has on the defense, he's done a lot of presentations on, last slide, locking down ColdFusion, doing other things. The other two guys are, well actually, I got a, should have been a line break there. There's basically 4 ColdFusion guys that talk security quite a bit, and then Chris Ng's stuff, and then the EU sec paper from 2006, or things if you want to get into this some more. So any questions? All right, I'm going to escape before there's any questions.